Under the blazing sun of Athens, the city that gave the world philosophy and democracy, there rose another kind of fire, one that burned not in the minds of men, but in the flesh of women. The same streets that echoed with the words of Socrates and Pericles also carried the smell of scorched skin. Iron brands hissed against bare bodies, while the marble columns gleamed white above them. Citizens walked by without flinching. The cries were as common as the cries of merchants. Athens had made a spectacle of pain and called it order. The women did not scream only from agony. They screamed because that moment erased everything they had been. When the metal touched their flesh, they ceased to exist as daughters or lovers or human beings. They became property, the property of the state, of the city that taught the world the meaning of justice. The brand on their skin was more than a mark of ownership. It was the city's signature, carved in fire. In the heart of the agora, beside the statues of gods and heroes, the trade in bodies unfolded like any other market transaction. Democracy, that proud invention of Athens, had an unspoken foundation. Its temples and theaters were built upon a commerce so normalized that no one questioned its cruelty. In a city where every free man had a voice, half the population had no name. The system was efficient, profitable, and sacredly bureaucratic. A young slave girl could be bought for less than a jug of wine. Her price was written in neat figures on clay tablets, recorded and taxed by magistrates. Every transaction funded the very democracy that claimed to represent the dignity of man. To the Athenian mind, there was no contradiction. The philosophers debated virtue, while the slaves were displayed naked on marble pedestals just a few steps away. Buyers examined them with clinical detachment, checking teeth, hips, and skin tone like one might inspect a horse. The scribes tallied the numbers, the tax collectors stood by, and the city treasury swelled. The law was clear. The state owned not only the market, but the very act of violation. The branding iron, the brothel, and the temple all served the same master, Athens itself. The system had a name, pornai, the lowest class of women owned and rented out by the city. Their bodies were regulated by law, their income taxed, their suffering converted into civic revenue. The same democracy that outlawed tyranny had institutionalized sexual slavery. There were no protests, no revolts. To the Athenians, this was not immorality, it was economics. Philosophers wrote about ethics in the morning and passed the brothel on their way home. In their eyes, the exploitation of women was not a crime, but a mechanism, the necessary machinery of civilization. The brothel of Athens opened at dawn. Behind their painted doors, row after row of women waited in silence. They had names once, in languages long forgotten, Thracian, Persian, Egyptian, but those names were replaced by numbers and prices. Each woman was expected to serve between 8 and 12 men a day. Refusal was not an option. Illness was not an excuse. The men came from every class: sailors, farmers, merchants, soldiers, even the magistrates who collected the taxes. The walls of the brothel absorbed every sound, the coins dropping on tables, the grunts, the quiet sobs. Outside, the city went on celebrating its festivals and its freedom. For Athens, nothing was left to chance. Even suffering had a schedule. The brothel were inspected by officials to ensure efficiency. Ledgers were kept with precision. Names, dates, earnings, and deaths. Each death was noted as a loss of property, a financial inconvenience, not a tragedy. If a woman died from exhaustion, her owner could apply for compensation. If she became sick, the state granted tax relief. There was no mercy, only paperwork. And yet Athens called itself the cradle of reason. It was here that philosophers defined the very concept of virtue. But when Aristotle wrote about ethics, he did so with the screams of women echoing faintly beyond the academy walls. He taught that some people were born to rule and others to serve, as if hierarchy were a law of nature. Plato imagined a republic of ideals, but excluded those who had been branded by iron. Socrates questioned everything except the foundation of his own civilization. Their silence was not ignorance, it was convenience. What Athens perfected was not brutality, brutality is crude, but hypocrisy. The city did not hide its cruelty behind shadows, it wrapped it in marble, sanctified it, taxed it, and called it divine. The temples of the gods doubled as brothels. The coins offered to the deities were the same coins paid for the bodies of the enslaved. The priests themselves supervised the transactions. Religion became a theater of violence disguised as ritual. During the great festivals of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and madness, the city surrendered to a collective frenzy that it called worship. For 3 days, the boundaries between sacred and profane dissolved. Processions filled the streets. Music, laughter, and incense rose into the night. And within the temples, behind the draped curtains, another ritual unfolded, one that the philosophers never recorded. The enslaved women, the ponai, were offered as sacrifices of pleasure. Citizens lined up before the altars, each man paying his coin to the priest, each believing he was participating in a holy act. They called it the rite of fertility. The priests preached that the suffering of women purified the souls of men. Pain became prayer. Every assault was an offering, every scream a hymn to the gods. Blood and wine mingled on the stone floors, and the city's faith was renewed through the degradation of its captives. Some women died before dawn. Others survived only to return to the brothel, broken and voiceless. To Athens, these were not crimes, they were ceremonies. Archaeology, centuries later, would uncover what the philosophers never wrote. Beneath the ruins of the Temple of Dionysus, excavators found narrow chambers carved into the rock, iron rings embedded in the walls, grooves in the stone designed to drain liquid away. Blood, perhaps. Fragments of bone, small, light, unmistakably female. Scholars argued about the meaning, preferring to call them ritual basins or animal sacrifices. But the truth was written in the bones themselves. The instruments of devotion were instruments of torture. And above these chambers, the Parthenon rose perfect and serene. Its marble shimmered in the sun, a hymn to harmony and proportion. Tourists 2,000 years later would marvel at its geometry, unaware that the gold used to adorn its statues was paid for with the taxes of the brothel. Every column, every sculpted frieze was funded by the bodies of women who would never be remembered. The same city that built temples to Athena, goddess of wisdom, turned her gender into currency. In the eyes of Athens, it was all perfectly logical. The brothels were public institutions. Their taxes financed education, theaters, and temples. The magistrates issued decrees to regulate prices to prevent inflation in the sex market. They created bureaucracies to inspect the prostitutes to ensure productivity. They called this justice, the fair distribution of pleasure and profit. The democracy of Athens depended on these women as much as on its soldiers and philosophers. Some voices must have whispered dissent, but they were swallowed by the noise of the marketplace. No records survive of outrage, no treatises of compassion. The moral language of the city simply did not have a word for what it was doing. To question the system was to question Athens itself, and no one dared. Civilization, after all, demands sacrifices, and the women of Athens were its chosen offering. When a woman tried to escape, her punishment was a lesson to the rest. In the same agora where Pericles delivered his speeches about freedom and civic virtue, fugitives were crucified. The spectacle lasted for days. Passers-by paused, observed, and continued on. The city did not conceal its cruelty. It displayed it. The body on the cross was not a crime. It was policy, the visible symbol of the invisible order. Even in death, the women served the state. Their agony transformed into public deterrence. Their corpses were thrown into the sewers that ran beneath the temples, the same sewers through which the city's waste flowed to the sea. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover skeletons with fractured ribs, crushed pelvises, and skulls split by blunt force. The remains told a story that marble inscriptions had erased. Beneath the grandeur of Athens lay a graveyard of the unacknowledged. The philosophers had written that reason separated man from beast, but in Athens it was reason itself that justified barbarity. They had built logic to defend the indefensible. Every act of cruelty had its philosophy. Every atrocity had its rationale. The citizens convinced themselves that these women were not truly human, that they lacked the rational soul that defined a person. And once you strip someone of their humanity in theory, you can destroy them in practice without remorse. The miracle of Athens was not democracy. It was the invention of moral blindness disguised as enlightenment. The city found a way to celebrate justice while committing injustice, to speak of freedom while maintaining bondage, to create beauty from the profits of degradation. And the world centuries later would inherit not just their art and their philosophy, but their capacity to forget the cost of both. Athens did not fall to foreign armies. It began to rot from within the moment it convinced itself that cruelty was civilization. The same intellect that wrote tragedies about hubris lived inside a system that practiced it daily. The city that glorified wisdom became the architect of systematic suffering. And the irony is that they recorded everything, every law, every tax, every speech, except the screams that made it possible. Beneath the polished marble and the rhetoric of justice, Athens had built its greatness on a foundation of bones. Every stone of the Acropolis carried the echo of those who had been erased. The city of light, it turned out, had always cast the longest shadow. Centuries before Athens crumbled, its decay had already begun in the places no philosopher ever looked. In the silence of the branded, in the stench beneath the marble, every speech about liberty, every verse about virtue was spoken over a mass grave that no one dared acknowledge. The miracle of reason that the world would one day idolize was, in truth, a mirage reflected on a pool of blood. The city that called itself the mother of democracy had birthed something else entirely, a civilization that worshipped freedom while feeding on the flesh of the unfree. When the festivals of Dionysus ended, when the crowds dispersed and the streets were swept clean, the victims were returned to their brothel. The ones who could still walk were expected to resume their duties the next morning. The ones who could not were sold for parts. Hair, jewelry, even teeth could be resold in the markets. To the men who counted coins in the agora, these women were columns of numbers, and the ledgers did not distinguish between the living and the dead. The economy of Athens was built on circulation of money, of ideas, of blood. The taxes collected from prostitution funded everything the city admired about itself: theaters, festivals, roads, temples, and schools, all financed by the exploitation of the bodies it had enslaved. Even the Parthenon, that perfect harmony of stone and geometry, was paid for in part by the income from the brothels. Each chiseled detail of the goddess Athena, symbol of wisdom, was purchased with the degradation of women stripped of both wisdom and dignity. The Athenians believed they were building monuments to the divine. In truth, they were entombing their conscience in marble. The system was so organized, so meticulously documented, that it resembled the machinery of a modern bureaucracy. There were officials whose sole duty was to manage the public women. They inspected them for diseases, collected taxes, and ensured quotas were met. Proxenetes, the state-licensed pimps, kept records as precise as those of a temple accountant. Their ledgers noted every client, every payment, every death. If a woman became ill, her owner was compensated by the state. If she died, the loss could be written off as a business expense. It was cruelty disguised as administration, and Athens excelled at it. Even law itself, that supposed cornerstone of democracy, was complicit. The courts of Athens heard cases involving prostitutes as if they were livestock disputes. The judges ruled not on questions of morality, but on ownership. If a man damaged another man's slave, the penalty was financial. If he killed her, it was still financial. The concept of justice, so eloquently theorized by Plato and debated endlessly in the assembly, never reached the women who made it possible. The same voices that demanded equality among citizens remained silent about those who were denied citizenship altogether. The philosophers, those architects of Western thought, became accomplices through omission. Socrates questioned the heavens and the nature of truth, but never the screams beneath his feet. Plato envisioned an ideal society, but left no space in it for the enslaved. Aristotle went further, giving the system its intellectual armor. He wrote that some people were slaves by nature, born to serve the free. With a few words, he transformed brutality into philosophy, oppression into order. The justifications of Athens would echo through centuries, becoming the backbone of every empire that followed. Athens taught the world not only how to think, but how to rationalize evil. It gave us logic and rhetoric, tools that could be used to elevate the mind or to bury the truth. The same rationality that built the Parthenon could justify a marketplace of human suffering. The same rhetoric that inspired democracy could defend slavery. The brilliance of Athens lay not in its ideals, but in its ability to mask its contradictions with beauty. When archaeologists began to unearth the ruins, they found traces of this hidden machinery. Beneath the temples and theaters lay chambers too narrow for living quarters, with grooves in the stone that ran like veins across the floor. Chains still clung to the walls, rusted but unbroken. In one excavation, hundreds of small bones were found, the remains of women and children, many showing signs of fractures and blunt trauma. Official reports called them ritual remains. The word softened the truth. Even in death, the city refused to name its crimes. The denial continued for millennia. 19th century scholars, eager to romanticize Greece as the pure cradle of civilization, erased the evidence with words. They translated ancient records selectively, omitting the sections that mentioned the taxation of prostitution. They called the underground rooms storage vaults or ritual sanctuaries. They polished the marble and ignored the stains. For over 2,000 years, history chose beauty over honesty. Yet the stones themselves remember. The inscriptions that survived, price lists, contracts, temple accounts, speak more truth than any philosopher's dialogue. They record the cost of a girl from Thrace, the tax rate of a brothel, the earnings of a priest who supervised a sacred orgy. These cold, bureaucratic fragments expose what the poets concealed. Athens did not simply tolerate exploitation, it institutionalized it. The freedom of the few rested on the submission of the many. As the centuries passed, the glory of Athens began to fade. After the Peloponnesian War, the empire crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The same state that had claimed to represent all citizens had built its wealth on those who had none. When defeat came, the philosophers blamed the gods. They said the city had lost divine favor. But perhaps it was not the gods who abandoned Athens. Perhaps it was humanity itself. No civilization can survive when its morality rots beneath its monuments. Athens fell not to an army, but to its own reflection. Its ideals had devoured their meaning. The democracy that preached equality had divided people into souls that mattered and bodies that did not. The city's pride became its curse.
For centuries it had declared that reason could perfect man. But what it perfected was cruelty. It created a machine so efficient, so logical, that it no longer required conscience to function. The people no longer saw evil as evil, they saw it as administration. And when morality dies quietly, no army is needed to finish the work. What remained after the collapse was silence. The bones beneath the Acropolis lay undisturbed. The ledgers turned to dust, but the pattern survived. Every empire that followed, Roman, Byzantine, modern, borrowed from the Athenian design. They copied its architecture and its governance, its laws and its rhetoric. And in doing so, they also inherited its blindness. The legacy of Athens was not just philosophy, it was the art of forgetting the victims of progress. Even today, tourists walk through the ruins with reverence. They take photographs of columns, trace the carvings of the friezes, and call it civilization. Guides speak of Pericles and Phidias, of wisdom and balance, of democracy and light. Few mention that beneath those stones are the remains of thousands whose suffering financed the beauty. The marble shines too brightly for the shadows to be seen. The air still carries the illusion that greatness can exist without guilt. But history, no matter how buried, whispers through the cracks. The bones do not lie. They tell a story older than philosophy and truer than rhetoric. The story of how enlightenment built its temples on silence. Athens became a mirror for every future civilization that would claim to stand for freedom while practicing oppression. The modern world still invokes its name as a symbol of progress, forgetting that progress itself is often purchased at the cost of invisible lives. The truth is not that Athens failed, it succeeded too well. It showed that a society can celebrate justice while thriving on injustice, can worship reason while institutionalizing cruelty, can preach equality while practicing hierarchy. It proved that beauty can coexist with horror so seamlessly that generations will admire one and overlook the other. And perhaps that is why Athens continues to fascinate us, because it is us. Every time we glorify its marble temples without remembering the blood that built them, we repeat its sin. Every time we quote its philosophers without questioning whom their wisdom excluded, we inherit their blindness. Every time we speak of democracy without confronting its foundations in exploitation, we resurrect the ghost of the agora, where women were sold as property beneath the sun of reason. Civilizations do not die when they are conquered. They die when they lose the courage to face their own reflection. Athens perished not in war, but in denial, in the refusal to acknowledge that its light cast a shadow too dark to ignore. Its ruins endure as both monument and warning. Beneath every stone of the Parthenon lies a truth carved in silence, that the price of greatness, when paid in suffering, always comes due. And so, as the wind moves through the broken columns, carrying with it the dust of forgotten lives, one can almost hear what history tried to erase. The faint echo of voices that refused to be owned, the whisper of those who were never given names. Their bones have outlasted the philosophers, the generals, and the kings. The marble still glows under the same sun, but beneath it, the earth remembers everything. When you stand before the Parthenon and marvel at its perfection, remember that every perfect line conceals a wound. The geometry of its beauty is the geometry of pain. The same city that gave birth to democracy taught the world how easily democracy can coexist with atrocity. Athens was not destroyed by barbarians. It was destroyed by its own brilliance, by its ability to justify the unforgivable. The stones of the Acropolis do not speak, but they do not forgive either. They wait for those who will finally see them for what they are. Not only a monument to civilization, but a tomb of its victims. The white marble still gleams against the blue of the Aegean, pure and silent. But the silence is deceptive. For beneath every tourist's footstep, beneath every flash of admiration, the dead still murmur their question. What is freedom worth if it stands on the backs of the enslaved?